All right, I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. I just got started into chapter 2. Paul is talking about the differences between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of God a little bit. I think that one of the good ways of understanding the wisdom of the world is to start with the assumption that there really is nothing wrong with us. If you start with that assumption that there's nothing wrong with us, then the conclusions that we derive through reason and thought and argument, the conclusions that we derive can be assumed to be correct. And that's what they've got. They've got these conclusions in Greek philosophy, which is a way of describing the wisdom of the world. And these conclusions come from the premise that there is nothing wrong with us. If there would be a recognition that we are flawed, that there really is something inherently wrong with us, then we would know that whatever conclusions that we come to are quite likely going to be flawed also. Just because somebody comes to a conclusion that sounds really good to them, they really like it, and they find, that it's popular because a lot of other people like it too, that doesn't make it right. That doesn't make it real. It may be real in their own fantasies, okay, but that's still not reality. So I think that this is a good way to understand and compare the differences between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of God, is that the wisdom of God is not something that originates within us. It's something that originates from God. And so if we will rely on Him, if we will believe that He is, and that He shares, and that He sees, and that He knows, if we will just believe this and trust what He reveals, I'm sure that over time, as you see the consequences of believing and trusting in Him, that you will grow to really appreciate the fact that He gives us His wisdom, and we can rely on His wisdom through the divine revelation instead of trying to figure everything out on our own. I think that's a big difference. So Paul is talking about the wisdom of God and that it was held up in a mystery. It's been hidden in effect. And I was explaining in the previous message that I think the reason why He has made it so difficult, really impossible, for an unbeliever to know His wisdom is because He wants to be the one to share it with them personally. I really believe that that's what's on His mind, that He wants to be the one to share His wisdom with you personally, and that is why it is so difficult for those who are mature to share the wisdom of God with those who He has not revealed His wisdom to. That's kind of an obstacle, but I think that's because He wants it to be personal, with everyone. So let me start out in chapter 2, verse 1. And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Okay, now this is a way of comparing, and he repeats this again in verse 4, which I'll mention in just a moment. He's comparing his approach of communicating with them with the way that the philosophers would have been communicating with them, the philosophers in their community. All right, that he's presenting the testimony of God in a different way, all right, than what they would be accustomed to. He presented the testimony of God in a way that he felt comfortable doing, that he believed would be more effective in sharing what he knew with them. What's going to be more effective? This is a very important point. When you are testifying to people about your God, who you know personally, you need to think about them, all right? You need to think about who they are, what they believe, What is the nature of their pride, perhaps? The more you understand about the person who you are testifying to, the more effective that you will be in testifying to them. You got to think about them. I've encountered a lot of people in my decades of doing this who talk to people as if those people are not even people. They have no regard for what those people think, for why they think the way they do, for what they believe. And no regard for that at all. They just beat them to death, all right, with whatever they want to, testify of, that they are wrong and this is the way to believe and this is the only truth and I've got it, I am the Holy One, and they talk to people like this without any consideration for who they are, for what they believe. It's just absolute disrespect and abuse, okay? I've known a lot of people like this in my lifetime, and it's not effective. It just isn't. It doesn't go anywhere. If the people who you communicate with, if you communicate with them in that way, the only thing they can do is just get rid of you. Because obviously there's no debate going on. No debate at all. No discussion. This is not a debate or a discussion. This is just violence. All right? Think about the people who you are talking with. When Paul approached these people, he gave consideration to who they are, and what they believed already. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I want you to try to keep in mind is that the Holy Spirit of God will occasionally give us guidance. He will give us guidance when we are communicating with other people. I call that a way of understanding how he will speak to us. How he will speak through us to others. All right? That if we will be sensitive to them and be sensitive to the Holy Spirit dwelling within us, that this can make a big difference when it comes to how we communicate with people. All right? We don't need to start with, this is a bad idea, okay, what people will start with, okay, let me get properly educated on how to talk to people, and so I'm going to be properly educated by studying the philosophers, because they are good at talking to people, and I'm going to talk to people just like these philosophers talk to people. Sometimes that might work, but Paul was not going to compete with the philosophers in Corinth in this way. All right? He wasn't going to compete with them by presenting the living God in the same way that they would present their philosophy. Instead, he approached them in a unique way. All right, now in the way that he approached them, this doesn't mean that this is the way that we are all to approach everyone. It's just how he talked to the Corinthians. Okay? And it certainly is not the way that he continued to talk with the Corinthians. But when he was there with them and he was reaching out to them, he talked to them in a certain way. So I want you to be sensitive to this and understand that just because he did it, with this group of people, that doesn't mean that automatically you have to do this with all the other groups of people that you ever encounter. I just don't think that that's what Paul was intending at all. I don't think that's what God has in mind. Be sensitive to the individual people you are speaking with and to the Holy Spirit who is within you, who you are representing. All right, in verse 3, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 3, I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom. Instead, it was something else, and I'll finish verse 4 in just a moment. Okay? He was there speaking with them with a sense of weakness, with a sense of fear, with a sense of trembling, not trying to persuade anybody. With the persuasive words that they would be familiar with, definitely not applying human wisdom, which is a way of saying Greek philosophy. He's not trying to apply that. He did not approach them in this context. He approached them in a way that was different than what the other wise guys would do. All right? And, this could get somebody's attention. If I approach a person with a sense of fear, trembling, nervousness, to approach someone and say, I have some things to share with you. Would it be okay if I told you about something that I discovered when I was over in Jerusalem? Would you be okay with that? Instead of, I have the profound truth of the universe, and you are going to be so privileged to hear me tell you what it is. Is that really going to be effective? Okay. Is it really? Maybe some people will be impressed by something like that, but, that's not what he did. He approached them in a different way. It doesn't mean that he didn't do anything. It just means that this is how he entered into their life and how he started a functional relationship with them. Now, just because you have this kind of posture doesn't mean that you are compromising on your convictions. Okay? Just because you have this posture that he describes as having this sense of weakness, that doesn't mean you're compromising any of your convictions or your beliefs. It just means that you're not going to approach them with some sense of overbearing strength to try to wrestle them into believing that God is real. Okay? But to do so with a sense of weakness, a sense of patience, a sense of kindness. All right? That's different. There's a difference there. With a sense of fear. It doesn't mean that he's terrified. It means that he has a certain amount of respect for them. A certain degree of respect. Just as the fear of God is not being terrified of God, but having a sense of awe and respect for who he is. And in much trembling, that's the cautiousness of, maybe you're not going to believe this. That's what I personally get the sense of when I read through this. Okay, and my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom. Now let me tell you, if you can say something in a way that people don't expect, if you can say something in a way that they're not familiar with, if you use words that are not complex but are unique, in communicating something, you can get somebody's attention with that. All right? You can draw somebody's attention. It doesn't have to be like everybody else. If it's the way that the Lord has spoken to you about how to say something, let it be. And when this happens, you'll notice what I'm talking about. That it's not about what you say or how you say it. In fact, if it is different and unusual and unexpected, it can be quite profound just because of the difference there. So instead of all of that, what he was relying on, was not argument or presentation, right? Which is what, the philosophers were doing in order to convince someone, to persuade someone. He's not there to persuade anything. He's there to demonstrate some power. Okay? Which means what? Is it power that Paul has? No, of course not. It's not the power of Paul. It is the power of God. And when God demonstrates his power, it's what he does, not Paul. Okay? It appears that Paul understood that God was going to do something. Now, we don't know what that was or what those things were. All right? I just wanted to mention that Paul was, I'm sure he was kind of out of the way to let God do his thing. Let God do the God thing and give some demonstrations of power and see what he's going to do. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when he wrote the second letter to these people, he does mention this in chapter 12, verse 12. He says, "Truly, the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance in signs and wonders and mighty deeds." We just don't know what they were. Okay? We don't know what they were, but we know that they fit into this category. All right? I think it's important to understand that we don't have to know what they were. I'm sure that if God really wanted us to know, if it was important to know, then he would have left some, evidence, some documentation, some better references to, he would have told Paul, I'm sure he would have found some way to tell him, listen, would you be a little bit more specific? Those were some really good things, let's be a little bit more specific and so that they're not forgotten. Okay. But it appears that whatever they were forgotten. I think it's more important to understand that whatever they were, it was God who did them. The power of God was manifested by him. He was there with Paul, and he did his thing just as Paul did his. Okay? Paul didn't express power, all right? But God sure did. When they were working together. This is great, because the Corinthians would see that and say, my goodness, this definitely did not come from Paul. There is a God who is working with him, and so Paul, what is this about? What does this show us? What should we be thinking? That would be the consequence of the revelation of power. So we don't know exactly what these things were, but they fit in the categories of signs and wonders and something quite profound. Now today, he doesn't often do these signs and wonders. If we go through the book of Acts, for example, we can see that there were a lot of exciting things that God did. And I'm not saying that those things are not happening today or weren't happening yesterday or won't happen tomorrow. If the Lord wants to do that, by all means. But I see that there is a power of God manifested within every believer, okay, if they are maturing in their faith. And this power that's manifested is a changed heart, okay? Anybody can tell the difference between a mature believer and anybody else, even the immature believers, okay? People can tell the difference. They know that they will know that there is something different about you, that you have a unique, changed heart that has been transformed by the power of God, and this is a way of saying that you were once like them and now you are like somebody else. You're different. That it's something that God did within you. It's not something that you did within yourself. All right. And this, of course, is going to be perceived by the other people, not something that you assert yourself. You're not going to be able to go to people and say, I am different, can't you tell? That's not going to work. All right? It's got to be real, as the Lord really does do a work within your heart to change your heart. They will see him, or they won't. Maybe they will just see you and your pride. That happens a lot, so don't be confused by that. Just know that there exists a power of God today within all of the mature believers that he has because of what he does within them. All right. Okay, so verse 4. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Now, this is unique. He said, look, I approached you in this way because you're accustomed to other things. You're accustomed to the persuasion and the arguments, the philosophies. That's what you're accustomed to. But in this case, God wants you to believe because there's some demonstrations that show that what Paul was sharing with them was true. All right? That was a completely different approach that was taking into consideration who the Corinthians were and also being sensitive to the Lord doing his thing at the same time. Again, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, that their faith would not be because they were convinced, all right? That they weren't convinced into believing in the gospel. That's not how this was handled. Now, if it's handled that way with people, I would say if it works, it works. Why complain? If a person gets saved, they get saved because they were convinced. But that's not what was going on here. What was going on here was that Paul did not even bother trying to convince them. He didn't go to them to be persuasive, all right, to be eloquent, to impress them. That's not what he was doing. He wanted them to have their faith based on the revelation of the living God and the power of God displayed through the signs and wonders and the miracles that took place. Through those things, their faith would be based on that, where they could say, well, this wasn't about being convinced. I saw this happen with Paul. And with this happening, Paul then told me about the God who made it happen. And so their faith would be inspired by what happened, as opposed to, the argument of being convinced of something, of being persuaded. Remember that these are people, before they are saved, these are people who are spiritually dead and are not going to understand or comprehend the wisdom of God. So don't bother expressing to them the wisdom of God. It's not going to get through to them. And even now, they may be born again, but they are still quite immature. They're not ready to handle the wisdom of God. That's what he told them. They're just not ready for it. There's a lot for them to learn, for them to discover. Okay? And so he's talking with the Corinthians, telling them that he wants them to believe. He wants them to have faith. But in this case, not through persuasion, but through the revelation of the reality of God. And God did that. He showed himself to them. So on that basis, look, regardless of what wisdom or persuasion or discussion or philosophy, regardless of that, pay attention to what he did. Pay attention to what he did that they witnessed or that others witnessed who are close to them. Verse 5 again, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. All right, again, not the wisdom of men, and definitely not the wisdom of God either, because they couldn't comprehend the wisdom of God. That would still be hidden and a mystery because he was not able to reveal that, but he can show them demonstrations of his power. Verse 6, however, we speak wisdom among those who are mature. All right, however, we do speak wisdom, but not among you. And so there is wisdom of God. He's already said a lot about that, right? The wisdom of God is foolishness to the world, and the wisdom of the world is foolishness to God. He said, we do speak about wisdom. We just do it amongst those of us who are mature. All right? And what would define a mature person? This would be a person who God has revealed some wisdom to. So then we have something to talk about with each other. God revealed this to me. And you can say, oh yeah, he's revealed that to me too. We have something to discuss. Well, how did he do it with you? How how did he do it? With me, it was this unique experience. It was this unique part of my life. This is what was going on. And he managed to use it to show me this, and he showed you the same thing, but he did it in your life and in your personal struggles and sufferings and experiences of life. That's something that we share with each other. How did you come to learn this? Wow, that's amazing how you came to understand this, whatever it may be. That's how we mature believers talk with each other. We encourage each other by, confirming with one another what God revealed to us personally. So among the mature, they talk about, the wisdom of God and the hidden mysteries of God all the time, because they have something to say about it, and not because it's an instruction. All right, we can testify of the mysteries of God, but we can't instruct the mysteries of God. We can't persuade people to believe in the hidden wisdom of God. He has to give them that, and when he gives his wisdom to one person and he gives it to another, and it's the same, then we are encouraged to know that there's a higher probability that we really did hear that from God and we didn't hear that from some other spirit that we shouldn't be listening to. This makes a difference, and this is why we talk with each other whenever we get the chance about these things. I believe that this is real. What do you think about that? And they would say, well, I don't know, that there's something else that wouldn't fit, that we know is true, and that just doesn't fit in well with that belief. And so talk with the Lord about it a little bit more and see what he has to say. That's an example of a common conversation. Again, in verse 6, however, we speak wisdom among those who are mature, yet not the wisdom of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. Definitely the wisdom of God. Verse 7, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory. All right, for our glory in the sense that we might be known. Now, not that we might be known in the same way that God is known, because God is impressive and we are not. But knowing that we are not, is meaningful. Especially when you start out with the idea that there is nothing wrong with us at all. The longer we mature, the longer we go in maturing in the faith, the more likely God is going to be able to show us the real depravity of our flesh. And the work that he does within us. There is a glorification of us in that context. Okay, not to be confused with the glorification of God. So again, in verse 7, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew. For had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. All right? Now, they crucified the Lord of glory thinking that he was not the Lord of glory. If they would have known what we know about the mysteries of God, the wisdom of God, if I was put in the situation today, for considering how I know the Lord, if I was put in one of those positions of decision making, that people would look to me to make a decision that could result in Jesus' crucifixion, would I participate in that? Not a chance, because I know who he is. I wouldn't want to be involved with that at all. Okay, if they would have known, as I know, they would not have been involved. They would not have been a part of that at all. Okay, I don't think that they were concerned about the consequences. Things like, well, if they would have known that a bunch of small groups would start, then they wouldn't have crucified Jesus. I don't think they cared. I really don't. If they would have known that there would be a lot of people who would believe in his resurrection, would they have crucified Jesus? I don't think they thought of that. After they crucified him, and all these small groups started, and there were all these people who believed in his resurrection and were talking about him and believing in a new covenant. I don't think that meant anything to them at all. I don't think they regretted their decision because there were all these people who were believing in the new covenant, in something different, and they were participating in society in a different way. I don't think that they regretted their decision of crucifying him because of that, or that the people were for some reason they increased in their spiritual insights. That now they talk about this God in this spiritual sense, and there's lots of people who are believing them. Again, I don't see that would be the reason why the leaders would regret the decisions that they made. I really do hold to the position that the reason why Paul mentions this is to say that if they knew that it was God, they would not have done what they did, because they would know that there would quite likely be a conversation between them and God about this. I could just imagine if I made a decision, oh yeah, let's crucify him, and I see the Lord in heaven, I go to him and he says, what were you thinking, man? What were you thinking? I was, and I could maybe say, well, but this is how you executed forgiveness. He says, yeah, but it was mean. You didn't have to do it that way. Somebody else could have done it, but you did that. You condemned me to death. You crucified me. You put me through all that pain and suffering. Did you really? You go to hell. I would expect something like that to be, the nature of the conversation if I was making a decision like that. Without any sense of repentance, but going to him saying, oh yeah, I did. I made the decision for you to be crucified because I knew that would be the way that you would invoke the new covenant. You would provide for forgiveness. I did that. I did that for you. I was a part of that. And he would say, no, we don't, we don't need that. We don't need that kind of person in our home. Thank you. All right. Again, in verse 8, which none of the rulers of this age knew, for had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him. Okay, now who are those who love him? Those are the ones who have been loved by him. All right, and I'll tell you, before he loved me, I definitely had no love for him. And it was only when that was realized that he began to show me things that he could never have shown me before. Okay, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, the thought has never occurred to me. Absolutely, that would have never been in consideration until after I loved him as he loved me first. And so that's how I see verse 9. Okay, for those of you who are using this for your small groups, I got a question for you. What are your regrets being in the faith? All right, that's an interesting question. You've been in the faith, you've been a Christian. Do you have any regrets about anything with regards to being in the faith? Okay, I've seen this. I'll give you a couple of examples, and you might pick them yourself. But one of the popular examples is tithing. When a person finds out, and I have a complete series on the subject of tithing in the Living God Ministries radio archive, you kind of have to just kind of plow through the first one. The first one is the shock and awe, and then the second one is where I actually start the topic. But when people go through something like that, and they realize that the law of tithing doesn't really apply to us anymore, and then what some people will do is they actually go back through their bank records and they calculate how much did they ever tithe in their entire lifetime, and they hold up that number as something that they absolutely regret. Okay, so it's an example of what are some of the things that you really regret in being in the faith. I think I got another example. Oh yeah, wasted time. This is another one. When you realize that you were believing things that were not true, you can get a sense of, gosh, I really feel like I wasted a lot of my time, and that is a regret of being in the faith. That you wasted a lot of time believing something that just wasn't true, only to find out later that there's a truth to hang on to and believe in. I'm going to say, listen, regardless of how much money you gave away to bad teaching, as much as you did, I don't think it really matters that much. I wouldn't think that it would really matter in comparison with what you have now. I understand that you lost a lot of labor, you lost a lot of value, but the value that you should have by now would more than compensate for the bill that you paid. Okay, more than compensate for that, I would hope. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's something to look forward to. Okay, with regards to wasted time, as long as you have embraced the truth, no matter how long it took, God would consider that to be success, even if you don't. And your time is not over yet. If it was, you wouldn't be watching this video. Okay? You wouldn't be here. Okay, so you're still here. You still have some time. Use what you have. And don't let the past get in the way of what you can do now and tomorrow. All right, so that's the question. What are some of the things that you may regret in being in the faith? And I'll continue in chapter 2 in the next message. Thanks.